Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Building Research Collaboration in Global Environments, which is sponsored by Springer Nature. This series is one in a session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'll now just put a couple links in the chat for where to register for upcoming Choice ACRL webinars and where you can watch previous webinar recordings. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do submit your questions and your comments throughout. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Rebecca Cooney is the Chief Editor of Nature Mental Health, and Simon Baker is the Chief Editor of Nature Index. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm Simon Baker. I'm Chief Editor of Nature Index, and probably just to give everyone a quick rundown of what Nature Index is. I don't want to assume everyone knows, but it's a database that tracks research articles in a set of sort of journals that have been independently chosen by researchers as high quality. It's not just Nature journals; it goes across all publishers. It was set up originally or launched in 2014 when it tracked articles in around 68 natural science journals. There was a review in 2018 and this became 82 journals just covering the natural sciences. And then for the first time last year, the index included some clinical medicine journals as well. And so is now more than 140 journals. And the main reason the index does this and tracks these articles is because it could track contributions to the articles according to authorship. So we look at affiliations and track the affiliations on articles, and then fractionally count those authorships within the articles to look at contributions by to research in these journals by institutions and by countries and other entities as well. And my role at Nature Index is essentially to lead the editorial content that we write, independent editorial content that we write alongside the sort of database. So we publish a series of supplements each year that look at different trends in research for countries and disciplinary areas, and use the Nature Index data for sort of insights that lead our kind of editorial content. But some of the main things I wanted to talk to you about today was obviously research collaboration and what the index data can help sort of tell us about research collaboration as it is at the moment. And I put here some global trends in collaboration to start with, which are not going to be surprising to a lot of people, to be honest, but some of the things that we found through some of the research at Springer Nature. But the average number of authors by publication steadily increasing across all disciplines since about the 1980s. A Nature analysis has found from the Dimensions sort of database of research that over the last sort of 20 years, international collaborations have risen by about 20%, so now roughly about 24% of all papers. By 2021, collaborations involving 3 or more countries accounted for about 30% of international collaborations. And there was also an uptick in collaboration, obviously due to the COVID pandemic and specifically in the disciplines related to COVID. And there's also been a growing trend of increasing collaboration between academic institutions and corporations, and there's some figures there on that. There's also the growing trend towards hyper-authorship, and this is where, especially in physical sciences, we've seen an increase in the number. It depends. You can obviously define hyper-authorship in different ways, whether it's papers with more than 50 authors or more than 100. But it's obviously that was a trend led by the physical sciences, but it also happened in the medical sciences more too, due to COVID. There was a COVID paper, for instance, with more than 15,000 authors on it. And data in the Nature Index sort of backed this up. In medical and health sciences, number of papers with 50 or more authors rose from about 58 to 203 in 2021. But still, physical science is the most common discipline where this happens. And the index can, this is where fractional counting of authorship in the index is kind of useful, because obviously on a paper with hundreds of authors, then if we are looking at contribution by a country or institution, then we only look at that contribution, that affiliation, if however small. If it's a hyper-authored paper, then we would only count, say, if we were looking at the number of authors from the US, if there's only one of 100, then that would only count as 0.01 in terms of our counting of contributions. Just a graph here to show you how the increase in the number of hyper-author papers in the index has increased in the last few years in just a few different disciplines. Now, why the index is very sort of helpful in terms of editorial content and looking at research policy, which is something that I tend to lead on. I've been interested in writing about for several years as a science journalist, is the collaboration data can be used to look at quite important global research trends. We can analyze the papers to see where there's been collaboration, say, between China and the United States, and that has clearly dropped off in the last few years in index research. And there's been other analysis that's done this in other databases, but it's something that we can clearly see in the index. So global research trends is something we can track really well. But other trends that we can track in the index include institution collaboration, whether that's domestic or international, between different types of institutions. So we can zero in on the collaboration between academics and corporations, or academic institutions and government institutions, or between healthcare institutions and academic institutions, which is quite important for clinical research. But we could also look at entities like cities, and look at collaborations between those. We could, by looking at the institutional addresses, we can look at collaboration in terms of the UN SDGs, because all the articles that we track are often tagged according to the SDG that they're most relevant to. And something I wanted to talk about specifically today was that you can look at collaboration between the global north and institutions in the global south, and the trends there as well. So I just put a chart here to show how we can look at institutional collaboration, for instance. This one actually shows the leading global collaborating institutions in cancer-related research. It was in our recent cancer index supplement that was published in early September. And we can see here how a domestic partnership in China has increased its contribution to the index over time in the last few years. And then this is an example of how we can track SDG related research. So we isolated articles that were relevant to the SDGs 12 to 15, which are the ones that are most relevant to climate and conservation research, arguably. And there you can kind of look at, this is showing collaborations between countries, and how China and the United States, although it's dropped off in recent years, it's not dropping in terms of collaboration towards these SDGs. But there you can notice a fall there between the UK and the US. And then this is an example that I just wanted to show you on city collaborations. So in our we publish a supplement usually every year looking at this in particular, science cities. And here we can look at sort of some network. We've featured some network graphs that look at collaborations between cities in the US and China, and how the patterns are very different. So in China, Beijing is very much a central hub for collaborating with other cities in research, although Shanghai comes a close second. But in the US, it's much more multi-dimensional, and several cities are hubs. So global North-South collaboration is something I wanted to focus on today, particularly, and that's just this is a new kind of approach for the index. It highlights difficulties, firstly, in how you define global North and South. It's a term we've in the supplement that's coming off decided to look at it in terms of World Bank income groups, separated countries that way, but that's by no means, that's certainly up for debate, and there's lots of different ways that you can do that. And also by doing this analysis of collaboration between the global North and South, I found by looking at the data that it really raises questions about where the institutions in the global South are publishing, and whether looking at just index journals is really a satisfactory way of doing this, and it highlights issues around selectivity in publishing. And also the index is mainly natural sciences, so it does skew the data that way a little bit, but it's a very rich source of data. And I just wanted to give you some early kind of insight into the data that we found on global North-South collaboration, which is going to be published as part of our supplement coming out in December. So this is data that isn't actually publicly out there yet. For instance, here, this is just some overall trends in collaboration between global North-South. It actually shows that the total number of papers published in Nature Index journals that featured authors from the global North and global South. And you can see there that the overall count of articles has been rising over time since the index was launched. There was a drop-off in 2022, but the index did drop in sort of volume from 2021 to 2022, is likely related to the pandemic. But at the same time, if we split those articles and look at the proportion that this is taking all articles in Nature Index actually, and then the blue area is just those articles I was talking about previously, you'll see that North-South collaboration is a tiny amount of research published in this selective set of journals, which is clearly a problem, I think, for global science. Even within the collaborations, this is looking at the articles just that feature North-South collaboration again, the contributions are dominated by authors that are based in the North. There has been a kind of increase, I think, over time, where the South is slowly becoming more of that set of articles, or representative of that set of articles, but it's still probably not satisfactory. Another way to look at this is we can look at the countries that are involved in this set of global North-South papers. The US still leads, but India, which has been counted as a South country because of the World Income Group it's in, is second in terms of representation on these papers. And China is actually low down, but is rising quite quickly. Here I've just highlighted how, if you look at collaborations on this set of papers between sets of or bilateral collaborations, so papers that involve authors from two different countries, the US and India is by far the biggest partnership. But you can see, I think the trend down between 21 and 2022 is due to the overall volume, but you can see some trends there in terms of there's been a growth of China and India involved in publishing these papers. So although, just moving on for global South and North analysis, that it is possible to analyze different collaboration trends in the index, it's still difficult to track a lot of collaboration in science using bibliometrics, not just the Nature Index, but It's difficult to track it in other databases too. And these are some of the examples of the types of collaboration that if the community can think of innovative ways to track this, then it's going to be really helpful to science in terms of showing where there's a lot of impact. Community engagement is a big one, I think, and something I've written about before is that when researchers maybe work with a community group, especially in social sciences, they may work with youth workers, for instance, on a project. Yeah, how do we capture that information? How do we show how those collaborations are actually impacting science? Another one is working with policymakers. Although there are tools now to kind of show the impact of research on policymaking by looking at references, for instance, in policy documents, actually tracking that collaboration between policymakers and researchers may be difficult if they're not actually featured on papers. Again, support staff is another example. Researchers will work with support staff all the time in their institutions on their research projects. Do they always gain credit in terms of authorship? This is obviously an issue around credit and authorship, but if you can't track that, then in databases that you being able to look at the collaboration and impacts of collaboration is a really important thing to be able to show. And the same for multiple collaboration networks, or looking at collaboration, if you wanted to look at the collaboration specifically between researchers at different career stages or researchers from different backgrounds, how do we do that? And I suppose lastly, from my portion of today's session, I just wanted to talk about a case study that we've featured some articles talking about this in the upcoming supplement on Science City. So this year for our Science City supplement, we decided to look at a specific theme of collaboration, which is collaboration between urban-based researchers and rural communities. And if you actually look at the index data, it's quite difficult to do because unless obviously most academic institutions are based in cities, and if you like, as I was saying in the previous slide, if you're working with community groups that then maybe don't feature as authors on a research paper, then how do you track that collaboration in terms of published research? But we commissioned some journalists to look at some specific projects for this supplement that show just how rich that collaboration is. So in the US, we looked at a couple of particular projects. We've looked at what the University of California system is doing in terms of rural collaboration. There was a very interesting project involving some researchers at Berkeley that have been working in a rural town called Allensworth, where there's a problem with arsenic contamination in the water, and they've been using a water filtration system they've been developing to try and improve the water there. We also looked at a project where Harvard's been involved with some communities in Alaska and working with actually on the ground with clinical groups in terms of improving health outcomes for indigenous communities in Alaska. And we've also, I haven't mentioned it here, but we looked at a specific example in China where the technology that's being developed there for solar panels is being used to try and alleviate rural poverty by building more solar panels in villages. And I think this is kind of just shows just how they're great examples of how research is impacting rural areas, but it may be difficult to capture that in data. Probably the best we could do with the index is we could look at, say, and I've featured it in this graph here. I've looked at just the 10. If you look at just research published by institutions based in Los Angeles, and then look at the collaboration between Los Angeles and other cities, you notice that, obviously a lot of the main cities that those institutions are collaborating with are also in California. But it just shows that how limited the data is, maybe in showing the impact of this kind of collaboration. So yeah, that's wraps up pretty much everything I was going to talk about today. Thanks very much for listening, and welcome. Happy to take your questions later on in the webinar. And I'll pass over to Rebecca.
Thank you. That was super interesting. We will queue up the next part of the talk here. And what I always begin anytime I am speaking with librarians and information managers is to just say what a pleasure it is to have a chance to do this. The reason why I enjoy this so much is because it gives us as editors an opportunity to really have sort of thought projects to come up with a theme and then sort of think about what we do in relation to what you do. And I think what is most interesting about librarians and information managers right now is that what we have thought of sort of traditionally as what that role is changing enormously, and it's changing in ways that I don't think most of us anticipated, which really speaks to the fact of how important and crucial these roles are to sort of the larger research endeavor. But I hope that this also gives you an opportunity to sort of think about your own value in relation to the institutions that you work with and represent, because I hope that it gives you sort of a lift in thinking about what you do in those capacities and what you can do, and sort of being instruments of change to sort of help make research more equitable and the quality improve. So I'm sort of thinking about collaboration here in a slightly different way. And I think one thing that we need to sort of from the outset think about is that collaboration is in essence a mechanism by which we promote equity in the world of research. And hopefully I can give you some examples of how that is the case, or at least how I sort of convince myself taking the Acela back from DC yesterday. The other thing too that was just sort of happenstance is that I just came from a meeting from the International Alliance of Mental Health Funders, where one of the key themes that they spoke about at that conference was collaboration. And so it brought up some really interesting ideas, and hopefully sort of, talking with a totally different group of stakeholders in the research process, there's some really interesting points that I think are relevant to all of us. So first, just to give you sort of instead of the 40,000 foot sort of, index perspective of kind of, cross-discipline, cross-publishing groups, but to look at one specific journal. So we're Nature Mental Health, and we sort of consider ourselves a multidisciplinary nexus. So a lot of fancy words for being really an outlet for all different types of work, but that converge on mental health and disorders of mental health. And so we really think about mental health very broadly. And so that means bringing in sort of the perspectives of social determinants of health, public health, and also, sort of the historical mainstays of clinical psychology and psychiatry, and sort of bringing these all together under one roof. And we formally launched this January, and we're online only, and we're a hybrid journal. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Our website's there. If you still are on Twitter or X, please follow us there. We'll also find new ways sort of going forward for you to engage with us. So, sorry, I skipped 2 ahead. So, and also just wanted to sort of show this is where we are so far in our first year of publishing, and we've been really lucky to get to work with a fantastic art editor to sort of bring all these to life. But I hope that this sort of gives you an idea of, our own orientation to sort of how do we bring color and imbue life to research in general, which can sometimes be sort of just print on page. So next up, so just to give you a sense of, what I was referring to as sort of being a nexus of a lot of different types of research, and how this sort of converges on the idea of collaboration too. We're really thinking about, not only being multidisciplinary, but across the lifespan. So looking at different age groups, a place where researchers including the global north and the global south, can have sort of their own community, creating a new community around this, and to find networking opportunities, especially for early career researchers, also including people with lived experience. But we also want to really focus on global mental health and bringing that within the mainstream of what we consider sort of mental health research in general, public health and policy, sort of as Simon just mentioned, how do these impacts of research end up shaping policy down the road? And I think that there's some fabulous ways that we can think of better ways to sort of track that impact with your help, and also underrepresented populations. So not only low and middle income countries, which I'll be talking a little bit more about too, but ethnic minorities, especially in the US, we have a lot of interest in this, LGBTQIA people as well. So just to give you sort of a sense of what our ethos is. So, and again, our aims and scopes are really thinking about this expansive view of mental health within the framework of human health, mental health as a human right and essential to an individual's well-being, and really with a core mission of advancing equity. And so here is where this notion of collaboration really becomes an essential tool. So just to give you a quick sense of what I'm going to talk about here. So in addition to what the benefits of collaboration are, but where those issues lie, what are the impediments currently, how do we facilitate research collaboration from various editorial perspectives, and then how might you support researchers in these endeavors? And hopefully we'll have time to kind of have some dialogue around this, because I'm fascinated to hear, see what sort of resonates for you out of this, and what we can talk about more. So I think this is sort of the standard representation of one of the major challenges within the sort of research enterprise and academia in general, that people who have historically been shut out of the publication sort of system and an engine. So the entire publishing system has sort of traditionally disadvantaged minorities. And because of that, people are underrepresented in academia and then are less likely to be authors, peer reviewers, editors. This leads to fewer publications from these groups, also less funding and opportunity for advancement and promotion. So you can see how this vicious cycle is sort of represented, and how this essentially this model of disadvantage sort of in being shut out from the academic publishing system applies to multiple groups of people. So one of the things that we think about is, how do we disrupt this cycle in academic publishing? How do we improve it? And it's really, a lot of that comes down to making commitments to diversity. And how do we improve data collection? How do we disaggregate groups in when we're doing large databases to make sure that we're reflecting the actual composition of those individuals? And what are the best practices across publishers? One thing I'll say here too is that I'll be referring to several Nature or Springer Nature specific policies, and what we'll do is put together a set of links that we can send out to you tomorrow, and that'll give you sort of exactly where you can find some of these policies articulated. But this has sort of this general notion that we need to disrupt how this cycle has traditionally existed, has led to a lot of publisher mandates and priorities that have been developed around these. And then how do we benchmark what we've done and where we're going, and how do we make that progress transparent? So you can see here too our diversity commitment and commitment to no manels. I think this has been something that we've talked about over the last few years, but clearly we're looking at how these various functions can be improved across authors, peer review, editorial board managers, and then in the in what we're publishing itself. So I wanted to focus here on two specific practices that are kind of thought about in relation to sort of the ethical arena of collaboration, and and we can find really well articulated policies too on the nature sites. But one is sort of what we call helicopter research. And this is, and then the idea is sort of dropping down into different contexts, doing research without, really incorporating those who live there, those who work there, those, people whose lives the research is essentially looking at, and particularly in lower and middle income countries. And a lot of this has to do sort of colonial legacies, but it's a form of exploitation of the involvement of research partners in those settings. Secondly is this idea of ethics dumping. And this is sort of exploiting potential loopholes that might exist in a lower and middle income country, or lack of oversight or regulation, and doing what would essentially not be possible in high income countries, and doing research in those situations. So these have been sort of two specific practices that a lot of the policy that's been developed has gone around. How do we prevent these situations from happening? And so what I wanted to point out here is sort of, again, this idea of collaboration as a mechanism for equity, but also as part of the, broader initiatives around DEI, and that, it's not just sort of, single policies that get put in place, but sort of a broad journey that we are continually coming up with ways to improve. But this is what I would consider sort of the top level publisher sort of commitment. And from Springer Nature, there's sort of, these 4 areas that have been codified. One is really about raising awareness and using the global code, which we'll send a link to. When you are developing a study, conducting it, and communicating the results of those of the study itself, creating transparency. So a lot of this has also coalesced around doing inclusion and ethics disclosures, which we can show some examples of during peer review and in the published paper. Citation diversity. So when we're looking at sort of the list of references that come with a paper, is it going to be regionally diverse? Does it really extend to the context that is being researched? And inclusive peer review, and sort of coming up with better internal standards about how we involve local and regional experts in peer review. And so these are really sort of steps that have been identified by our publisher. Next, I wanted to point out sort of some of the steps that we as an individual journal have thought about in terms of how we can help support DEI and inclusive collaboration here. And one is really active consultative engagement with communities and stakeholders. And this can be anything from how we, refer to a group of people in verbally in text. So for example, LGBTQ, how, working with people within our organization and externally to think about how do we best represent individuals, but to make sure that we're actively engaging in a dialogue, so that these are not necessarily policies that we're generating in a vacuum. We're also providing reviewer training where we can. So for where in lower and middle income countries that may not have some of the resources available within the academic setting, how do we help bolster standards and make sure that people feel empowered to accept reviewers' invitations, identifying where barriers to accepting invitations exist. So sometimes language can be an issue, but also I think more broadly thinking about things like time constraints, and people who are caregivers may not feel at liberty to accept invitations in the same way. And being very clear about what our internal equity guidelines and goals are for our journal and for our publisher. How do we assess our own personal biases? The word that I always like to stick here is homophily, that sort of groups with that editors often can end up inviting people who live in the same country context that they do, or people who are sort of have the same background that they do. And I think this is a really good way for us to sort of challenge how our personal biases and regional differences in how reviewing is undertaken. Also transparency about what the process is going to look like and what the expectations are for the various stakeholders within the research framework, acknowledging the heterogeneity of the publishing ecosphere. There are discipline and domain specific differences that can contribute. Medical anthropologists have a lot longer timelines than some of the other biomedical experts, and so having a sense of how these things can be played out and being very clear about sort of unpacking them, and also how do we provide recognition and promote the work that's being done beyond simply a paper being published. So we're always trying to think about how do we extend the life cycle of papers. And just to even bring it more closely drill down into one journal, I just kind of wanted to use these as an example of papers that we've published in this last year, that of our first year of being, and how we thought about these. And it's very important when we are, for example, publishing a paper that looks at a country like Lebanon, is to make sure that we have representation from Lebanon in the sort of expertise, and that can be both in authors, reviewers. It can be a real challenge. It's often that there are other issues that might prevent people from being able to commit to a review or can be involved in authorship. But I think that having this sort of at the forefront of policies is really important for us to be thinking about. But also the value of having expertise and perspective from the countries who are being represented in global mental health, for example. This can be hugely important. I was thinking of sort of the provenance of this perspective piece and how very crucial the comments of the reviewer that we had, who was from one of the lower middle income countries, that helped shape the perspective into a much more insightful piece because of that. Also, in, for example, the paper at the top and sort of looking at epidemiological studies, how do we make sure that we have reviewers looking at manuscripts and making sure that they understand what the context is? There are very different potential sort of psycho and social issues related to a non-suicidal self-injury in China than there might be in other high-income countries. China sort of has the unusual handling of being sort of both middle income and high income. And so knowing that we want to make sure that we have someone who is familiar with the culture context here and weighing in from that perspective is really important. So what that brings me to is thinking about what you can do as sort of this next portion of this framework. And so it was really interesting being in this other conversation yesterday. I think one of the takeaways that I had from this was to really think about the Sustainable Development Goals and how those shape very largely some of the research agendas and priorities that are underway, not only for in collaborations between the global North and South, but also South-South partnerships, and how, for example, and in implementation research, and thinking about operationally how to roll out or scale up different types of interventions, for example, really require partnerships between South-South country contexts and researchers from there. And I think that there's also there's growing research funding within middle income countries in particular. And much of these different country contexts organize a lot of their research frameworks around the SDGs. So I think as we sort of are moving forward, especially where there is multidisciplinary research, where, for example, in mental health, where it can really bear on social determinants, thinking about things like urbanization and how these sort of connect back to the SDG framework are really crucial. So the way that I've heard this sort of portrayed is the idea of SDG literacy. And I think that there's a real opportunity for librarians and information managers to be really up to speed on some of the different type of work that is coming through the framework of SDGs. And that really leads to the second point, is becoming agenda setters. And so as knowledge partners, partners. I think that there's a really fundamentally important role of helping, the institutions that you work in, the departments and the researchers specifically, and coming up with where they have capacity to improve that research, where the gaps are in terms of the research frameworks, helping them refine the research questions and strategies. And this sort of relates to the second. There's been such a boom of, because of open access, the amount of information that's available to you, but helping researchers to sort of narrow down that which is going to be the sort of corpus of work that they're going to want to draw on. And I think, again, too, also in terms of the framework of SDG literacy, thinking of these sort of in these broad collaborative ways of where you might see synergies between different types of work or different researchers within your institutions. So there's a real opportunity there, I think, to help and to sort of, focus some of these research questions and strategies going forward. And then finally, to be open science champions. And I think most librarians and information managers would say, well, of course, we're open science champions. And that is very true. But I think we have to think a little bit more about what we mean by open science. And it isn't necessarily just about making a paper open access. This really sort of refers to the entire openness of the research enterprise. So this is data accession. This is how do we make sure that studies are reproducible, because we are making sure that we're sharing protocols or intervention manuals. How is code accessed? How do we make sure that code is not only verified, but that we have tools in place so that people can access that? And so there are ways as publishers and editors that we can include those elements within papers that we publish, but it really requires the help of librarians and information managers to make sure that those elements are not only open, but sort of supported and going forward. What are the best practices around them? So thinking more broadly about that. So that's essentially where I wanted to, before I signed off here, I just also wanted to just say one last bit about the Sustainable Development Goals. Assuming that everyone is aware of these, but also sort of the open-ended targets in terms of research that we're given. So, for example, Target 3.4, which is the one that's most relevant to our journal, and reducing mortality from non-communicable diseases and promoting mental health. But to think in terms of how this might drive research priorities, we're talking about very sort of general concepts, but at the same time, they're that way for a reason, and that is to help facilitate collaboration. And so you can imagine things like sustainable cities can be very related to these. And so again, sort of bringing that into our SDG literacy, sort of all of our SDG literacy is how do we make sure that we're helping to support the research that allows us to get closer to making traction on target. And how I always close any of the talks that I've done with librarians is to quote Audre Lorde, who was a librarian, and that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives, and to think more broadly about how we use mechanisms of collaboration and how we think broadly about how to improve equity for researchers and for ourselves and for humanity. So I will stop there, and I think that gives us some time also for discussion.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much to Beck and Simon for your presentations. That was great. I'll just encourage all attendees to submit your questions, so we have some time to answer those. And I'll also launch a quick poll here that you all can fill out in the meantime as well. Okay, so we have one question here from Elizabeth, who says, how many of the articles/content in Nature Mental Health are published open access? So Beck, could address that.
That is a great question, and I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I could find out. So one of the things too, in terms of how editorially and publishing, our sort of firewall is that editors don't necessarily know if authors have elected to publish their paper open access. And really that is by design in order to make sure that, that people aren't sort of preferentially publishing papers that are open access. There are also two various forms of open access, and that becomes relevant. So obviously gold open access is what a lot of people consider, and that's where the license is transferred after paying a fee to the authors. But there are other forms of open access, like green open access, where a preprint or the approved version of the accepted version of the manuscript is deposited on a repository. And so it is difficult for us to track that to the singular degree. But at this point, being that we're hybrid, so some of the papers are published open access, it's still probably less than a third, but we anticipate that will probably grow as we start publishing more papers. But we are very pleased to sort of have the option that not only can we offer open access, gold open access, we can help support green open access, and we also sort of have the traditional authorship route.
Great. Okay. Great. Okay, we just got another question here from Philip. And I think this is for Simon. Philip asks, really interested in the concept of citation diversity. How is it evaluated, i.e. rubric? Is it captured or can it be captured in the Nature Index?
Thanks very much for that question. With citation diversity, I'm assuming we mean their types of citations. So whether a citation is referring to canonical works, or whether a citation is referring to it's just referring to previous examples, or whether it's a citation that's kind of being used to kind of show that that a result is different from previous literature. But which I think is a really fascinating area, from something where I've seen there being some policy papers written about this, and how we can maybe start to address look at citation analyses in the way of incorporating that citation diversity in there. That may not be what was meant by the question, but it's worth pointing out with the Nature Index that we don't, unlike a database like Scopus or Web of Science, we don't have citation metrics. We literally in the index track all these articles in this set of journals, and then we can count the authorships, or look at the authorship data on each of those papers, and then from that estimate the contribution of various institutions and countries. But unlike other databases where they may say, well, if there's one author from the United States, that counts as an article for the United States, they often count it in that way. Any article that has a United States author will be counted as one. In the index, we fractionally count, and so split up all the authors. So if you have an author, or have 100 authors on the paper, we will split the kind of credit, if you like, on that paper by 100, divide it by 100, and then add them up according to the affiliations. So that's what's kind of different about the index, I guess. But what we don't do is analyze citations. We don't look at citation impact, which has disadvantages in that that's the main currency of analysis of impact, research impact. But I think it also has advantages in that we there are a lot of question marks about citations, and whether the assessment and the analysis of citations in bibliometric databases actually has influenced behavior in terms of citation, and whether because of that you end up with lots of you have citation networks, or cartels as they sometimes called, a little bit more nefariously, I guess. But whether the impact of science being measured means that people are using are manipulating citations in some way, and at least in the index we don't have that. But going back to the question, if by assuming that citation diversity would mean different types of citations, then I think that's really important to kind of find a way of tracking citations in that way, because then you can start to unravel some of the problems that there are with citation analyses. And I know that there are tools out there that are starting to do that.
I would also add too, on an individual paper basis, I think that editors actually, I mean, much of this is a manual process too, of, at the level of an individual paper, sort of, what is the orientation of authorship? So have we only made sure that the sort of first author is from a specific country context? What about the rest of the authors, the anchor author? And I mean, you will see definitely there are clearly still remnants of that. The first authors tend to be from high income countries, even if they have collaborators within a specific context. I think that also sort of behooves the process of the sort of author and inclusion statements and sort of the justifications that researchers make for how they have determined those authorship positions. And clearly, the impact on certain types of journals, especially journals that really have a global focus, where that becomes an extremely important practice. But I think much of it is still very manual. And I think also, but connecting it kind of with the sort of the index approach, is that we need to come up with better ways to do that. And one sort of basic practice too that I really encourage, and I'll also speak for my team, is that making sure that individuals on a paper are discoverable by having their ORCID account linked, having their email address. We need to get better about making sure that when something is indexed, that there's a way to actually access the other authors, beyond just the specific first author. So lots of things to think about, lots of ways to, I think, librarians and information managers can help support that process too.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, I mean, if we're thinking about in terms of authorship, I think that's a really important point that Beck makes there about whether we can gather more information about authorships and whether, especially diversity and background issues, it is already very difficult to. I mean, it's a very difficult subject, because once you get into areas about data protection and privacy quite quickly, actually, when you think about whether there's some way of including this information with authorships, and whether people would always have be able to opt out of giving certain types of information. So, how do you then assess that data in a fair way? But I mean, certainly, for instance, something that I would really like to do is to track authorship data according to gender across the world and globally, and look at the contribution there. And you can imagine how you could actually get some really rich source of data in terms of just in different disciplines about female researchers and how their prominence in different disciplines, and how whether that's tracked over time and changes there, would be really interesting to look at. But to my knowledge, it's obviously to actually look at authorship data and be able to assign gender to authorship data is kind of, there are ways of doing that do that to a certain degree of accuracy, but you can't obviously be, especially when you think about the global context of names, and all you're doing is basically assigning that on the basis of names, then you're obviously getting into very tricky territory, and something which I know other organizations have tried to do, but you have to be very transparent about the methods that you're using to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Thank you both. Yeah, Philip says thanks. And we have opportunities to try and locate research from the Global South so that local knowledge and research can be disseminated. Great. Yeah, I have a question for Simon. You talked about this in your presentation, but you mentioned that index data on global North-South collaboration may be skewed by discipline. I think you mentioned natural sciences. Could you talk about why that is, and if there's a way to get around that?
Yeah, so the main kind of issue there, I suppose, is that at the moment the index covers journal up until about last year. The index only tracked natural science journals around about 80, well, it was 82 to be exact. Journals were included, and they're in 4 sort of broad subject areas. So chemistry is one, biological sciences was another, physical sciences, and earth and environmental sciences, but all natural science disciplines really. And we've just last year added clinical medicine as well, which is a trickier process because the index only tracks primary research articles, and in clinical medicine journals you get a lot more other types of articles. So it's a technically a more sort of difficult sort of process to make sure that you upload the correct articles from those journals to the index. But essentially, I suppose what I'm saying is that those disciplines are still sort of pure science. We're missing applied sciences really. There's no engineering is not fully covered really by the index. That you get some areas of engineering that are, but not everything. Computer sciences, we can track a certain degree of, say, artificial intelligence research, but actually a large amount of computer science research is not really tracked by the index, especially computer science research that's published through conferences, which actually in that discipline is around about half of the publishing of research publishing is done through the conference venue route. So we're trying to, and at the moment we're trying to figure out ways of including those in the index as well, and beyond that, social sciences as well is another goal. So I suppose, yeah, that what I'm saying there, so I've got a long way around, is that we're only tracking part of science, and so the data is going to be skewed. If you look at anything, whether it's global north-south collaboration between countries, it's going to be skewed in terms of those science disciplines. And so there's a lot more collaboration going on in, say, the social sciences between the global north and south, which I would think there might well be. And in fact, the data I showed you only looks at the natural sciences. It doesn't include the new health sciences journals. So anything to do with public health, where researchers are making a difference in Africa, it's probably not going to be captured in that data. So it is sort of skewed towards one area of science. And as we sort of develop the index and track more, then we'll have a better answer, I think, for looking at that global north-south collaboration and other areas that we want to track.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more or one or two. Beck, in your presentation, you talked about preventing helicopter research and unethical or inequitable research practices. So I was wondering if you have any guidance on where librarians or research managers can learn more about these issues to help inform their own institutions or patrons.
Yeah, so like I said, I'm going to put together sort of a list of links that sort of go, link to specific areas around policy that are, sort of, pan publisher sort of proclamations, but also some of the specific Springer Nature guidance around that. A lot of it, especially from the context of, dealing with patients or participants and doing, clinical or health related work, a lot of that really is incumbent on very, very early on and sort of getting institutional review approval and that sort of thing. But there are definitely further downstream issues that can come up to make sure that, for example, in authorship, so this far after perhaps the data collection has occurred, but then in sort of putting together a manuscript and deciding sort of authorship as well, and to make sure that that the relative contributions are represented. And I think, for most publications, we do ask for which each author has contributed, and to be very transparent about those things. But I think sort of, in any sort of consultation that you have with authors, is to remind them that there are these pieces of guidance out there, but we will make sure that we compile and get those to you so that you can reference them easily.
Awesome, great. I think we're pretty much at the end here. I don't know if we want to squeeze one more question in, or but maybe if you both could comment on just I know, Simon, you talked about tracking research relationships, and Beck, you talked about the logistics of fostering ethical collaboration. So I was wondering if maybe you both could comment on how and why tracking research collaboration helps to foster more collaborative relationships and ethical ones. Just to wrap up.
I mean, from my own point of view, information is kind of power, isn't it? And if you've got that kind of information and you can properly track, while you're not sure that you're tracking it properly, you can never. It's hard to encourage more people to collaborate in certain ways because they feel like it's not recognized, I guess. And the more you can do that, the more it's going to be recognized, the more it's going to encourage people to collaborate. That would be my quick comment.
Yeah, and I would also say giving researchers and sort of the different institutions the opportunities to find ways via webinars or conferences. That's actually one of the most equitable ways to be able to bring people around the world together that we didn't previously have that capacity. So I think it's a great question for us to be armed with data to give us a sense of where those inequities are, and then come up with sort of targeted ideas of how can we sort of narrow these gaps and across stakeholders, across different researchers, and across regions of the world. So I think that's the really exciting part, is that we do have ways of targeting it.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks so much to Simon and Beck for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your questions and your comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from this session and hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.